That was a nice introduction, and I'm not sure I know how to handle it. The only one I know who can really react right to getting that kind of laudatory introduction is Dr. Henry Kissinger, who's good at it. I recall a particular incident that I thought of as Sam was introducing me, that 1974, when Kissinger, as Secretary of State, was occupied in the Middle East in shuttle diplomacy, trying to bring peace to that disorderly part of the world. He came back to Washington something of a hero. There was a big reception for him at the State Department. And I saw a woman walk up to him at the reception with a rapt look in her eye, and she took his hand in her two hands and said, "Mr. Secretary, I simply wanted to thank you for saving the world." And he looked at her for about half a second and said, "You're welcome." Well, I don't have that kind of class in handling this kind of thing. But I did come here, and I came a long way. Let me first tell you what is both the good and the bad news. And that is that I arrived a little bit late, and this great university had a program set up for me that took me very briskly into one class after the other, and I never realized that from the time I got here at 3:30 this afternoon, I was never going to unpack or see my hotel room again. With the result that the speech that I spent 6 weeks writing is back in the hotel room. But that's the good news. Also the bad, could be the bad news. The fact is, what I will have to do is talk straight to you with nothing like that. And if I ramble a bit, excuse me. I know a couple of things I want to tell you, and I may tell you a couple of other things along the way. Let me start by telling you that I've reached a very strange and interesting stage in my own life. Last fall, I turned 70, and simultaneously completed my first 50 years in journalism. There were 50 years which had started in newspaper work, had taken me to Europe as a foreign correspondent, and then in 1953, when suddenly there came a cable to me, I was living then in Holland, from Ed Murrow, which asked whether I would be at all interested in joining the staff of CBS News with a first assignment in Washington, and then 25 years at CBS, and then a couple more years when I wrote a newspaper column and taught journalism at Berkeley as a Regents professor, and then a call in the middle of the night from Ted Turner, who does most of his calling in the middle of the night, telling me he wanted to start a new television network and he wanted me to be the centerpiece of it. And that last 6 years, where we had differences. And then back to one of my earlier loves, radio and NPR, where I now spend a great deal of my time. And somewhere, it doesn't seem like 50 years, but 50 years in journalism. And once I reached that age of 50, I began to look backward. I still look forward, and I still look at where we are now, but I began to give some time to introspection about the industry in which I had worked, and what it means, and what its place is in society. And some of the things I thought about bothered me. I thought about my role in some things, and they bothered me. I was bothered by the fact that in my general preoccupation with getting a news story, and during my CBS days, trying to get that story on the evening news with Walter Cronkite, that I never thought very much about the effect of what I was doing and what all of us were doing around me. When I first came back in the mid-60s, in 66 exactly, from having been a foreign correspondent for a long time and hung up my trench coat, and wanted to learn a little bit about what was going on in my own country, I took an assignment which included urban problems in a period when there were big riots in Watts and Cleveland and Newark and various other places. And covering that in Washington, my beat, part of my beat, poverty, civil rights. And I found that as I began trying to get stories, that more often than not I would react to what producers in New York wanted. And you very soon learned that what they wanted was something that was a little bit more dramatic than was ordinary. And so when it came to covering the black protest movement and the demands to do something about the ghettos, that if you did interviews, for example, or covered hearings of Congress with some of the more moderate black leaders, you could get them on the air once, briefly, maybe twice, and then they seemed boring. They were boring because they'd said, oh, we need to give more resources to solve the basic problems of poverty which lead to riots in the ghettos. And when you began hearing about money and resources, after a while that got boring. But there was a new breed of black leader coming up at that time who, for television, was more interesting. There were names like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, and they were saying menacing things. They were saying things like, we're going to burn the cities down. They would say, Whitey, we're going to get you. And I found that when my work required me to do an interview with one of these people, more likely than not, a minute or a minute and a half of that would get on the air that night, which meant that I would get on the air that night. Because there was something about the effect of these things on television. They were made for television in ways that moderate people weren't. They served the demands of television as something dramatic and something confrontational. And after a while, a pattern was established where on a quiet day, I'd be asked to go and find out what my friend Stokely was saying today. And I'd take a camera crew and I'd go to his storefront headquarters in the middle of the Washington ghetto on 14th and U Street, and I'd say, and if they don't do this or that, then what will you do? And he said, well, if they don't do this or that, then we will, by God, it's going to be trouble around here and there's going to be riots everywhere. And that would get on the air. And what I didn't realize then, but came to realize only in retrospect, is that I, along with the system in which I operated, and the other networks operating more or less the same way, were making a selection in which we were crowning Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown as being big leaders because they were on television. And since television is the creator of identity for people, decides what's important and what's not, by doing that, we were making them important. I remember in 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King came to Washington to give a press conference. He was organizing a Poor People's March on Washington that he organized but did not live to see. But he came to this press conference to explain that there were going to be a caravan of poor people from the South, and they were going to come up to Washington. And right near Lincoln Memorial, of course, they were going to establish a little place called Resurrection City. And they would live there, and they hoped that people in Congress, people in the media especially, would recognize this as a metaphor for the unsolved problems of poverty in America. And he explained that, and then we, including me, began asking our questions. How far do you intend to go? Do you plan to any disruptive maneuvers? Are you going to stop traffic coming across the bridges into Washington? Are you going to occupy any federal buildings? We were inviting him to say something that would sound menacing enough to make an obvious story for the evening news. And he didn't want to do that because he was the symbol of non-violence. When the press conference was over, and he hadn't given us very satisfactory replies, and I was waiting for my camera crew to pack up, and he sat there at the table looking rather depressed. I asked him, I said, you seem not satisfied with this press conference. And he said, no, I'm not satisfied at all, he said. He said, I don't think you people in the media know what you're doing. But you are going to stimulate violence in this country. You are going to make it difficult for anybody to be a nonviolent black civil rights leader. You are putting on the air only the most menacing of statements, and therefore sending signals to black leaders that if you want to get on white television, you better say something nasty or do something nasty. And when it happens, you won't know, you'll cover it, and you people will not know that you helped to bring it about. That bothered me some. But, I thought about it for a couple of days and went on with my work, as we all did. But as I look back on it now, I begin to realize that it's indeed true that I've been working in an industry which does have a kind of love affair with violence, because it serves the violent and it serves television. Let me try to explain to you a little bit of what I think I've learned about the nature of television. Television is really, we speak of television when we talk about the news media. But the fact of the matter is, as I've come to realize, that television is not really a very good medium of information. Radio is much better, and newspapers are much better. Let me explain what I mean by that. Television is a theatrical medium, like moving pictures. It is very good for conveying experience. You can see it happen on television and get all the feelings that go with what happens on television. It can take you to the scene of riots. It can take you to the scene of hostage takings in the bank or whatever, and give you all the sense of being there and experiencing it. It is a medium to convey experience, but not a medium to convey thought or reflection or necessarily understanding. It appeals to the senses more than it appeals to the intellect. Frequently, you will, even with a Super Bowl game, having seen it, you want to read the papers the next morning to find out what it meant, what really happened. Frequently, you will experience things on television and see them and still need to know more about them, because television often doesn't convey more than the picture of what you see, and the picture of what you see does not always give you an understanding of what you see. Television isn't a good medium for that. Terrific medium to convey drama, emotion. And television knows that. Now, we who've come into television from other fields, and in the early days, anybody who did news on television had come from radio, and before then from newspapers. All your great television, radio people of earlier days were sort of drafted from wire services or newspaper work. Television in the early days didn't create its own news people. Today it does, but they are a different breed. But as we came on board, we found that something was very different, because the main function of the newspaper is news. Main function, not the only function. It has an entertainment function. It has Dear Abby, and it has comics, and it has art book wall to amuse you and other things. But the main function of a newspaper is news. In television, news is a minor function. It is a small group of people sharing a stage with entertainment, and inevitably obliged to adopt the tools and adopt the attitudes and adopt the standards that go with entertainment. In its smallest way, that means you got to make sure what number of pancake you're going to put on your face to make up. You got to know your lights and your angles, where the camera is. You got to know how to address somebody when you do an interview, and how to do anchoring at a desk, and how to read a teleprompter, but don't have your eyes fixed too much on the teleprompter. Every now and then look down a little bit as though you're reading, but you don't have to read, because it gives you more credibility when you're reading. All the little tricks. All the little tricks that go with being a part of this entertainment world. But it goes beyond that. It really goes to the fact that the material that you select to put on television inevitably has to fulfill the requirements of television, which means drama and confrontation, and where possible, confrontation involving violence, because violence plays on television like gangbusters. It plays in entertainment, bang, 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 and squeal of brakes and chases and all the rest of it, and it plays on the news side as well. And so over the years, you get on news programs, at very best, a slightly hyped up, condensed, toned down version of the reality of what's happening in the world around you. Not wrong, not distorted, except that there's an element of distortion in anything which emphasizes a certain part of it and not the rest of it. For many, many years I've known, covering congressional hearings, that I can get a congressional hearing on the air if the chairman, especially if the chairman is somebody known like Senator Kennedy or some other known person, yells at a witness and the witness yells back. Never mind about what. But when the decibel level rises at a hearing, the cameras roll, and you make up your little capsule of the events of a legislative hearing based on the only part of it that catches the attention of the producer, because he knows it's the only part that will capture the attention of the audience. May have been a long legislative hearing about some very important subject, but important things are not always said loudly. And television favors those who speak loudly, especially if they speak loudly at each other and yell at each other. That's showbiz. And we are in showbiz. We're trying to provide a certain kind of a element of what goes on, but we've got to do it television's way. And over a long period of time, the net effect of all of that is to give you a somewhat simplified and somewhat hyped up, somewhat overheated version of what goes on in the world. And for those for whom it is important to get on television, they know that. And they use that. They are not passive players in this thing. It's become very important today in the age of television to get on television. In a kind of a existential way, it's so happened that if you're not on television, you don't exist. If you're a candidate running for office, you count the minutes that you get on television. And then if there are not enough of those minutes, you may as well not be running for office, because you have to get on the media. If you have a product to sell, you'll buy the time to get on television. If you're the President of the United States, you'll command the time. And you'll know he's important, because he's right there on TV. But what if you can't buy it? And what if you're not the President? But what if you still want to have you or your cause still identified as being meaningful and real in the only way in this age that it is meaningful and real, by being seen on television? Well, in the most innocent kind of way, if the camera is there and you're in front of the camera, you'll wave. Hey, Mom, I'm on television. See me? If you get a little bit more desperate, you'll hold a riot for television. People have done that. I mean, in 1968, we discovered something which bothered us a great deal, but we didn't do much about it. 1968, at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, which was almost torn to pieces by anti-Vietnam protests among young people, we found that if we went out with a remote truck, its own lights, almost anywhere we went, where the kids were, at night, turn on the lights, and the kids would be there, and they'd be demonstrating and yelling, and down with Johnson, and get out of Vietnam, and they'd be all ready to go marching off. Turn out the lights and it would stop. Were we covering demonstrations or making them? It became a problem. A lot of very well-paid people sat around and considered the problem and decided, I have to write some guidelines. If you can determine that there is demonstration or riot held because you are there, pack up and go away. But how do you determine that? And how about the competitors if they stay? And then what do you do? Some people will kill to get on television. But I mean literally kill to get on television. I mean, there was the episode a few years ago in Indianapolis. Man, somewhat unbalanced, took a banking employee as a hostage and tied a wire around his neck with a shotgun pointed at him and said, "Get the goddamn TV cameras here, I'm national hero." Okay? He was holding a hostage. People were scared. He could have shot somebody. He had the life of a person in his hand, and that made him a national hero. This man ended up talking on the telephone to President Carter. He said, "I want to talk to the president." The president on the phone talked to him. Finally released the hostage. That one ended pretty well. But we were conveying this signal that, oh yeah, we'll play. It's terrific television. We'll play. Serves you, you get your identity, we get ratings. Who loses? Indeed, who loses? Let me now tell you a little bit about the story. John W. Hinckley, Jr., the young man who 6 years ago today, I think it is, shot President Reagan in front of the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington. I got interested in Hinckley, and I spent several weeks traveling around to where he had lived in Colorado, where he'd gone to school in Texas, trying to find out about him. He interested me because I began to realize I was interested in what was it about this unbalanced young man that would make him want to do that, to shoot the president coming out of a hotel in the presence of the television cameras, which are always there when the president comes out of a hotel. Young John Hinckley had obviously psychiatric problems. But he had grown up with television. He was of an age where he was just of the age, he was 25 then, he was just of the age where he could say he was a member of the television generation. He had never known life without television. I know maybe 2/3 of the people in this audience have never known life without television. I had a long life before there was such a thing as television. I remember when people read. I remember even when people talked to their children. I remember all those things. But John Hinckley, when he was born, television had just about taken off, and he knew television from the time he was born. But he loved television, and he especially loved violence on television. When he went to college in Texas, where he didn't study very much, he had a television set in a very bare room, where he would sit for 10, 12 hours at a time eating junk food and watching television, switching channels to find wherever he could find a real bang-bang entertainment show. His favorite of everything that he'd ever seen, which he saw once on ABC, and then went to the movies 12 times more to see again, was a picture called Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver is a picture about a veteran back from Vietnam who can't find his place in society, can't make it with a girl, and finally decides, in order to attract the attention of the girl that he's interested in, he's going to shoot and assassinate a presidential candidate, which will make him important, and that should make him endearing in the eyes of this woman who has rejected him. And John Hinckley goes out to reenact that. He's interested in Jodie Foster. He's in love with Jodie Foster, who will not give him the time of day. She's been attending school at Yale. He goes up to Yale, he stalks her, puts notes under her door, says he's in love with her, he'll do anything for her, and she doesn't know who he is, and she gets a little bit scared by that attention and nothing. And then he decides, well, if he kills a president, Jodie Foster will pay attention to him. He stalked President Carter for a while, but that didn't come up. And then finally, in the first year of the Reagan administration, one day, John Hinckley leaves his hotel in Washington, leaving on the bed in the hotel room a copy of the Washington Star, a paper that no longer exists, but on the front page is the president's schedule for that day, which since that day is no longer printed in newspapers. But there was the president's schedule for that day, and marked on the places where the president was going to be. One of those places was he was going to speak at a lunch of some labor group at the Washington Hilton Hotel. And the other thing he left on the bed was a copy of TV Guide, open to the program for that day. A program which he then set out to revise. Because from the time that he shot President Reagan in front of the cameras to make sure that I was put in record for history so that everybody would know what a national hero he was. Obviously, by 2:30 that day, all network programming had been changed, and there was Dan Rather sitting in front of the camera. There was Tom Brokaw in front of the camera, and America had come to know that when you see an anchorman at lunchtime, that something tremendously important has happened. That's our signal of a great event. Bang, 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 special bulletin, we interrupt, here is Dan Rather. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, wow, something's going on, right? And that's become a part of our ritual in America, the television ritual of catastrophe, television ritual of dramatic event is anchor people in the middle of the afternoon, for heaven's sake. That night, Hinckley was interrogated by the FBI and the Secret Service in the jail cell in Alexandria, Virginia. As it happened, the interrogation began at about 7 o'clock in the evening. And they began asking a series of routine questions, name, where he came from, and so on. And he interrupted and said, just a minute, can you tell me, is it on television? And they misunderstood the question at first, as though, what's the interrogation being videotaped? No, we're just talking to you. You know, that's not what I mean. What I did, is it on television? And the Secret Service guy said, there's been nothing else on television all day. And Hinckley said, that's fine. A lady wrote letters to Jodie Foster and to others and said, nobody will ever say that Hinckley was a nobody. I've made my mark in history forever. And he was right. He may have been legally crazy, but not stupid. He understood the way in which you get your identity established fast in this country. He had learned from television of violence as a commonplace thing. He had seen hundreds of television productions where you go bang, 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 and somebody falls down, but then comes the last commercial and everybody gets up because he's got to be on the same episode next week. And so violence has become commonplace and unreal. Something just happens on television. And that's what Hinckley did. He'd been raised on television violence. He had made his contribution to real television violence, and he was famous forever after. The guy who shot President Reagan. We give, in television, not only do we give rewards for that, but the film, the tape of that shooting and the shooting of Brady and so on was so dramatic that from then on that tape was played hundreds and hundreds of times, almost hypnotically. And of course, within 3 days, the Secret Service was having to intercept people coming to Washington to finish the job. For those who are unbalanced, all you need to do is keep looking at that time and time again. And it has this kind of hypnotic effect on you. One guy was arrested when he came from New York saying, I must finish the work that Hinckley started. He was arrested for threatening the life of the president. Well, what are you going to do? It's a hell of a piece of tape, isn't it? And on every anniversary, and every time the word president assassination is mentioned, you will see that tape again. And I guess, like me, you must have seen that tape now hundreds of times. And we now take it as a part of television history. But there are no psychologists who sit down and say that if there's been an attempt on the president's life and the whole country is upset about it, and there are other people out there who are somewhat unbalanced, maybe we'll just play it twice and not 20 times. Maybe the effect of playing this too often is to put ideas into the minds of people. There is nobody in television who ever thinks of the effect of what television does. There's an attempt to say, we're just doing our thing. And anything that may happen as a result of that is unintended, so therefore don't pick on us. The most dramatic case of television and its mindless love affair with violence, of course, is international terrorism. Now, it's long become clear that terrorists deliberately manipulate television because it's a part of what gives them power. When the American embassy in Tehran was occupied in 1979, these young students or militants or thugs, as they were variously called, took over the embassy, apparently planning just to stage a demonstration as they had done once before and stay there for a day. And then, as the then Iranian foreign minister, who has since been executed himself, Khopsadeh, as Foreign Minister Khopsadeh said in some secret negotiations with President Carter's Chief of Staff, Hamilton Jordan, the difficulty of getting the embassy free was that these people who occupied the embassy had become an important power factor in Iran because they had made it so big on American television. There were all these cameras outside the embassy gates day after day, and these kids realized that they had become very important. And so other elements who were supporting Khomeini, who really wanted to get them out and wanted to end it, found these kids were staying on and on and on because their control of American television had given them power in a factional fight going on right then in Iran. Hamilton Jordan has written this in his book. Anybody pay attention and said, hey, maybe we can report the story and then go away. Maybe if the effect of our being there, maybe if President Carter locking himself up in the White House and saying he's not going to campaign because it's such a big deal, maybe if Walter Cronkite didn't every night say this is the 223rd night of, maybe if Ted Koppel didn't do a show called America Held Hostage, maybe terrorists wouldn't feel so terribly important. Maybe they wouldn't feel that, well, good God, if we're that big on American television, we got to do more of this. Every time today you capture hostages, or you capture terrorists who've taken hostages, you'll find out, as they finally get to tell that story, that the manipulation of television, and especially of American television, is number one on their agenda of their planning. On occasion, as once happened, when they were stuck on an airport and negotiations weren't going anywhere, they began shooting hostages and tossing them out of the plane so the cameras would have something to take pictures of. When a group of Palestinian terrorists once occupied a meeting of the OPEC in Vienna, they were heard to say, let's wait to do anything till the cameras get here. It's all a part of their planning. And every time they have a success, you can count on their looking for another episode where they can have another success on our television. Mind you, I'm not saying that when these things happen that it's possible not to cover them. They're news, and I'm a newsman. What I am saying is that we in our business have to learn to draw the line between reporting news and exploiting the event. I think exploitation was the interview with the captain of the TWA airliner, the gun held to his head. exclusive ABC, 2 points in the ratings, I would guess, just that night, just because they had that terrific interview. But very bad in terms of trying to discourage terrorism around the world. There was NBC negotiated a deal, an interview with Abu Abbas, the terrorist who organized the hijacking of the cruise ship Achille Lauro. NBC agreeing under the terms of this, they would interview him somewhere, Algeria turned out, and keep secret where they'd interviewed him. I have a great American television network conspiring with a wanted terrorist to interview him and keep secret where he is as part of their normal activity. Exploitation is when you've got a terrorist story and you don't have any more pictures from Lebanon because nothing new is happening. Then you go to the relatives of hostages, day after day, week after week, and do those heart-rending interviews. What do you think the president ought to do? He ought to do anything he can to get them out of there. I mean, I don't know why we can't tell Kuwait to free some of the people they're holding in prison, people who incidentally were in prison for bombing the American and French embassies in Kuwait. Whatever it takes, I want them out. Well, what do you expect a relative to say? Relative doesn't make national policy. A relative is a loved one of somebody who was in an impossible situation. But is it news every week to go to Peggy Say and say, how do you feel about Terry Anderson is still in prison? They're still being held hostage. News every week. When I saw that happening, I said, why do you have to do that? I know it's good television. Tears at the emotions, tears at the heartstrings of America. Gallant sister of an AP correspondent being held hostage now, year and a half, 2 years. Good television. Well, is it news? Do you need to do it every couple of weeks? Do you need to tell time and time again about Jeremy Levin, who was hostage, CNN man in Lebanon, hostage who actually managed somehow to escape, but now is great international expert on terrorism who says, well, you got to think of the hostages, and we really have to do what we can to get them out? Well, yes. You would expect people who are concerned to say that, but national policy can't always be made that way. The price we had to pay for Peggy Say on television week after week, we now know from President Reagan. Robert Bud McFarlane, who himself tried to commit suicide, in part because he says he realizes that he was never getting through to President Reagan what it was he was trying to do, which was look for moderates in Iran. President Reagan said at staff meetings, I can't stand seeing Peggy Say every day saying, what's the president going to do? I want you people to do whatever it takes to get those people out of Lebanon. In May and June, you will hear Admiral Poindexter, and you will hear Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, and you will hear Bud McFarlane testifying. And if they're asked, did the president tell you to ship arms to Iran and trade them for hostages, the answer will be, first the president said, I want the hostages out and I don't care what it takes. And those are marching orders for us. Just as the president said, I'm not going to let the Contras down. And if Congress won't let me provide weapons for them, I want them somehow to get weapons. Those are marching orders. But somehow in the case of the president, sentimental, political, or let us say, with both of those true, the president surely is a great expert of politics on television. Heaven knows he is our first true media president himself. Whatever else he can do or not do, He understands this medium. He is a moving picture. He is a script waiting to happen. Things only go badly when somebody has not given him a script. But this is a president who has come to office because he understands the medium. He understands how to talk to the American people on it. And when he sees Peggy say, he understands the effect of that. And call it compassion. And there may be some of that in it, but although I found compassion seemed to increase exponentially the closer you got to Election Day. But there you have this cycle that we have built up. Terrorists do their thing. Television does its thing. President does his thing. And so we ship arms to Iran, and the president's worlds come crashing like a house of cards around him. And he goes around the country saying, I did or I didn't decide, or in any event, I'm sure that I don't remember. That I'm sure. And on another day, I'll do a speech about President Reagan and the way he got us to inhabit his dream, and the way in which he wanted to make a movie, and we liked the movie of America standing tall and morning again. And because he came to symbolize our hopes and our wish to have something more optimistic than Carter gave us, and the great desire of America to feel good again, and because he somehow reflected all that optimism, he got elected president twice, and the second time by a huge landslide. And that's another story, because I think that dream is ending for him, and I think that little dream is ending for America. We're all waking up and saying it was a wonderful dream, but it was a dream. But this man of television, who reacts to television, got this country into something of a mess as part of a cycle that goes around like that, and like that, and like that. When Vice President Bush went to Jerusalem last July, this was, mind you, after it was May of last year that McFarlane had been in Tehran and had left because they wanted 4 hostages and they were offered only 2. And so that was when McFarlane called it quits and came back. And in July, Vice President Bush, on a trip to the Middle East, was being briefed on all of this in Jerusalem by then Prime Minister Peres's anti-terrorist expert, Amiram Nir, who was deeply involved with it, and he had tried to explain to Bush and said, McFarlane made a mistake. He really should have taken the 2 hostages. That was the most that they were going to give him right then. You know why? Because if they gave all the hostages, they wouldn't have anything to bargain with. Now think of that. We had a policy of not rewarding terrorists and not giving them incentives to take more hostages by ransoming hostages. We created a situation with this arms for hostages deal, in which the logic of their situation was that they could not give up all the hostages, precisely because we had established conditions in which they needed to keep them in order to be able to bargain for more arms. That's what you call a counterproductive policy. Today, the president is going around the country, but no, this is not a speech about the president. I want to talk to you, he's got his errors. I want to talk to you about what's wrong in my house, the house of the media, and what we have to do about that. I've come to the conclusion that one way or another, we have to stop acting as though we're just little kids playing, and that the real world is out there and we're not part of it. We have to come to recognize what everybody else recognizes, that we're not merely observers of what goes on in the world. We're not really just reporting on it and telling you about it. We are the arena in which it all happens. It is done to get our attention. People will seize our attention. They will hijack television if they have to. That happened also once several years ago in Germany. There had been a hostage taken. A bank president was taken by the Baader-Meinhof gang, a group of hostages, a group of terrorists, demanding the release of some of their people from prison. So they were released. And one of the conditions was that their release of these people and their getting on the plane would be all shown on German television live before this bank president was released. And I was in Germany then, and one of the directors of German television said, "This is the day in which German television was hijacked." And I thought it was an interesting phrase, because I think it's a phrase we must remember, that there comes a point at which we let American television be hijacked. Oh, there have been some cases of attempted real hijacking, people trying to break into and take over television stations. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the way in which we sit there as sitting ducks, and when somebody does something in order to push violence on us, instead of saying, hold on a minute, how can we report this in the most restrained manner? It's not done. But the fact of the matter is, let me tell you the dark, dirty little secret inside television, of which I've been involved, so I'm not exculpating myself. When the bells ring on the AP machine 5 times, bang, 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 that's a bulletin. And you go over there, and if the bulletin is, a plane was hijacked today from, to, and its location isn't known, and it's not known yet, but there were 155 passengers, 65 Americans on board. The moment that happens, a tingle of electricity goes through the newsroom. And by now, everybody knows what to do. Get our State Department correspondent. Find out what they're doing at the White House, so on and so forth. Well, what's on the air now? We'll preempt at 3 o'clock. We'll move in, put up that thing, special bulletin. We interrupt and so on and so forth. It's become a regular ritual. Everybody gets very excited. It is when adrenaline flows, when news people feel like news people, and they're very important because you know why? They're going to stop a soap opera. That's power. And they're going to put on our soap opera and hold the air as long as we can. These are all people who will go home at night, kiss their wives and children, or whoever happens to be at home, and say, we had a great story today. I used to do that. Great story. Really tremendous. It takes a long time before you realize the way in which you conspire with the wrong elements to encourage the wrong elements. So I say, even before I'm asked, I say, well, should we pass a law and not let them do it? No, it's the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. The First Amendment says you shall pass no laws. What I do say is that we have to grow up. When Larry Tisch stops firing everybody at CBS, he might begin to look at policy and practices. And as to whether or not television is on the whole a good citizen or only interested in that bottom line figure that comes from ratings worth ratings point. CBS, a ratings point, 1 ratings point, prime time, translates into $16 million in revenue over a period of a year. You know what that ratings point is? That's you. Is your fascination with looking at these things. If you think that you're fascinated but that it is destructive, let them know. They're very sensitive to audience criticism. Now, having said that, and here am I, 50 years as journalist, and half of that time working in television, and what am I doing? Simply denouncing. Let me add one thing before I finish. There is another side to this. There is a very constructive side to television. First of all, what I have found is that at moments of great tragedy, that television performs the function of a public ritual for the whole nation. It used to be we'd all gather together in the marketplace and seek comfort from each other if somebody important and near or dear to us was killed. But when President Kennedy was killed, it was as though the family of America gathered together in front of the television set. And the fact that they stopped all their daytime and programming and kept telling us what was going on, happened in a way that would discourage rumor, a sense of identity with each other. In that way, television can perform a very constructive role of informing us, consoling us, making us feel that our institutions go on. There'll be a funeral, we will see the funeral, we'll see the next president will be sworn in, and the sense that the country exists, its institutions continue, television can present to us in a very important way. And I think that's terrific. I also think television and all news perform very important functions at a time when the president or people working for him are conspiring against you. And that's happened at least twice. President Nixon mounted a conspiracy against the press because only the press was going to penetrate his cover-up of Watergate. And today, perhaps not quite in the same Nixonian way, without Oval Office tape, without all the things that made the whole thing so dramatic then, also now, press is not going to let them get away with anything. And while you may think that story is overplayed, and I know some of you do, it isn't. And you will see when you see this thing enacted before your eyes by carefully prepared witnesses in May, in June, and July, when the hearings are held very responsibly by now joint committee of the two houses, you will see what it is that the press kept them from concealing, kept them from making a big secret so they could go on doing more or saying. You will see them, how they played fast and loose. When Congress said, don't send arms, they found ways of sending arms. They conspired between the CIA and a few people, Rambo-like figures in the White House, to simply try to evade the whole process by which America legislates, makes laws, and executes them. And only the American press does that. The French press wouldn't. The Soviet press couldn't. They all stand in amazement at the way our free press works, print and electronic. And that's the other side. I love being a news person. It's all I ever really wanted to do. And I love it still. And because I love it when it does its great things and great moments. I also want it to get its act together and learn or be taught by an aroused public. Get its act together and be a little more responsible. Thank you.